I used to leave the house to take a few walks along the canal next to my apartment. I would wave to the boats crossing the canal and gaze at the beauty of the swans. I used to listen to the children laughing in the park. I used to buy something for the beggar who lived under the bridge. I used to call him Mr. Tramp, but he also used to refuse to tell me his real name. That was my routine. It's quieter now. I haven't seen any swans or ducks around here for 2 years. The boats have been abandoned and marked with a notice written in red stuck on the doors, and now you rarely see anyone passing through the streets. After the swans and ducks disappeared, the city began to be covered in missing persons posters, from dogs to cats and various other types of animals. Their owners would find their body parts dumped behind their houses or in the street. I remember that once I found some foxtails at the back of my apartment. At that time, the emergency calls, the ones that inform you that someplace is being invaded, rang several times. As cruel as it sounds, I would do anything to hear them again. The police began investigating the disappearances linked to the disappearance of the swans and ducks. They couldn't conclude what had attacked them, and the pieces of animals that were left behind were often too small to identify any teeth or claw marks, according to the newspapers. People in the city became too afraid to go out at night, convinced that something might have escaped from a zoo. Since then, I've started seeing a lot of those animal control guys around the neighborhood. One night, a year ago, I started to think about it more. There had always been hit and runs in the city, but it was becoming something of a scare, as it had become commonplace to see a discarded squirrel carcass while walking through the park, or bird feathers strewn across the ground, and the remains of a duck stuck in the trees. The authorities never blamed a predator when the swans were all gone. It used to be the fox's fault. Now they know better. I think that whatever it was, it had to have much bigger prey. I called the police the next day to report that Mr. Tramp had disappeared, as I hadn't seen him on my usual walk along the canal. They said there was nothing they could do and that perhaps he had moved somewhere else. Who could blame him? I didn't even know his real name. Months passed, and the nights became even quieter. There were no more bird noises to wake us up in the morning. There weren't even any drunks stumbling around after a night of drinking. Most of the bars and restaurants had closed, and people simply didn't feel safe going out anymore. The police were still investigating, but I never saw them on the street any more than I saw anyone else, making the town very lonely and causing a lot of people to move away. The only ones who stayed couldn't afford to leave, just like me. I was barely making ends meet and couldn't afford a trip like this. You could only see people during the day, and they were always in their cars. At sunset, there was no one left on the streets. All the curtains were closed, and people left their lights off with their garbage a long way from home. The garbage bags dawned in pieces, and anything edible in them disappeared during the night. The streets were full of garbage that people threw on the sidewalks, and the state had stopped sending men to collect it. I phoned them once, but the only answer I got was, "This service is suspended due to departmental restructuring. Sorry for the inconvenience." I had received 2 phone calls at the time. The first was from my boss, who said, "Don't bother coming here. We're closing the store. I'll try to leave your last paycheck for you to pick up as soon as I can. And I'll try to pay you severance pay. Use it to get out of town." I never received that money. The second call was from my landlord, who just left a voice message. "Hi, I've canceled the direct debit. Don't give me any more money. I feel bad about taking the apartment from you. Please just leave town. We all know what we should do. Maybe if I'd gotten that money from my boss, I could have run away. Not that I had anywhere else to go. Just getting out of there would have been better than staying." I took my last walk along the canal, but as I approached the bridge, I noticed something in the water, a piece of a rib cage floating in the water. I hoped it didn't belong to whoever I was thinking of, but I knew it was true. I called the police even though I knew what I would hear and what would happen. An officer made a quick report about the incident, telling me not to jump to conclusions, and another officer would be assigned to investigate. I knew no one would. I was exhausted, worn out, and overwhelmed by the knowledge that nothing could be done. That poor man never even told me his real name. The next day, I was talking to my neighbor, an older man who had lived here when I moved in. He was in the same boat as me, with no friends, no family, and nowhere to go. He even tried to persuade me to leave and mockingly said, "A young, lively boy like you should get away from here. You don't need any money when you have this much vitality." Anyway, there was no one else around to take me anywhere. I said to him, "He's getting closer to the houses." As we looked out of our first-floor windows along the canal, he replied, looking out of the window and shaking his head slowly, "Yes. Did you hear the sounds he makes? I've never heard such sounds coming from a fox or a badger." I looked out of the window. The trees along the bank of the canal had scratches and broken branches, as if something big had climbed up there. He asked, "Did you see what happened to the first-floor window?" I certainly had. It had been ripped out of the frame, leaving a large gap in the wall. The inside of the apartment had been turned upside down. The furniture had been broken, and there was blood, hair, pieces of flesh and bones all over the front room. Curious, I asked, "Who lived there?" The old man's hands were shaking as he spoke. "A man who lives with his little daughter. Do you remember? You went to his house once when he was ill." I couldn't answer. My neighbor said, "George." His name was George. He made a gesture while putting his hand on the marks and scratches that were in place. I was going to ask him why, but why bother? I remembered that the following night was the worst of all. The screams and howls I heard were like nothing I'd ever heard before. I had left my window open, but half ajar because it was too hot to sleep. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard heavy footsteps and a snoring sound. I froze, terrified. I could feel my eyelids peeling back in my skull, and my chest went cold. I was so scared I thought my heart was going to burst out of my mouth. My legs and arms retracted into a fetal position, so I waited with my back to the window. After a few minutes, the whole room shook as a heavy thud hit the wall behind me. A roar reverberated through me as the sound of fingernails scratching something began. The sound quickly became more pronounced and more disturbing. I searched for less frightening explanations to try and reassure myself. Maybe it could be the wind or the trees. It could be anything but what it really was. No matter how hard I tried to find an answer, I knew it was worse than any desperate explanation I could give myself. I even thought for a moment that he might come into the room. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep or passed out from fear. When I woke up the next morning, I hoped that it could all have been a dream, a nightmare. So I went outside to see my neighbor. The door was locked and he didn't answer. I went out to see if I could see him through a window. Then I saw outside my window scratches, long marks under my window. They didn't look like anything I'd seen before. I was scared again. Not just scared or worried, I was really scared. So I called the police once again, but there wasn't even anyone answering. There was just an automated message that said, "The police station is unable to process calls at this time. We advise residents to stay with family or friends who live far away if possible, while we investigate these events. If this is not possible, please remain indoors and lock up. Avoid making unnecessary trips. Under no circumstances leave your home at night. Do not investigate any strange noises or events. Just stay calm. We're investigating." I'm glad I didn't see what it was, you know. I'm glad I only heard the scratches and noises and only saw bloody footprints scattered on the flower bed. I'm used to living in fear now, but I don't want to live with nightmares either. Whatever it is, it's getting bigger every night. How could something so big walk around without anyone seeing it? But I know that at any moment, I could have a face-to-face encounter that would be the worst thing in my life, and maybe the last. Leaving the city is the toughest battle I'm fighting. Leaving on foot would take me at least a day to walk to the nearest town, which would be enough for me not to reach my destination. That's probably the last thing I'll say as a good deed in my life. If you hear about a quiet, isolated town, famous for its parks with swans and ducks, don't go there. If you like horror stories and unanswered questions, consider subscribing to the channel for more. See you in the next video.